This week, at least 33 pardoned insurrectionists have since committed additional crimes since January 6th, including child sexual assault, terroristic threats, domestic violence, and conspiracy to murder FBI agents. And yet, Trump indiscriminately pardoned all of them. When you reward and normalize criminal behavior, of course you invite more of it. And the president didn't just free his rioters for doing his dirty work, he punished law enforcement for doing their jobs, purging hundreds of career FBI agents and prosecutors just because they worked on J6.
You want to lecture me about corruption, Professor? Then let's start with how a single phone call turned into a fortune, Donald Trump said. And in that instant, the room seemed to inhale and forget to exhale. The sentence landed not as an argument, but as a provocation, the kind designed to hook attention so completely that the audience no longer asks whether it agrees, only whether it can afford to look away. As someone who has studied American political rhetoric for years, I immediately recognize this as a deliberate opening strike, not meant to persuade in a traditional sense, but to seize narrative control before rules or context could slow the momentum. This was not a debate in the classical meaning of the word, and anyone expecting a balanced exchange of ideas had already misunderstood the nature of the event unfolding in Phoenix. What followed would be less about proving facts and more about defining reality in front of thousands of people, hungry for clarity in an age that rarely offers it. The Phoenix Convention Center had been full long before sunrise, filled with supporters who believed they were attending a constitutional dialogue and sensed almost instinctively that they were about to witness something far more combustible. 5,000 people do not gather quietly, and the energy in the room carried the unmistakable charge of expectation, mixed equally with resentment, curiosity, and a desire to see someone challenged without restraint. Trump stood at the center of that energy with the ease of a performer who understands crowd psychology, while Jamie Raskin prepared himself with the posture of a man accustomed to explaining rather than being interrogated. The contrast between them was visual as well as philosophical, with Trump relaxed and expansive, and Raskin precise, contained, and visibly committed to the dignity of procedure. From the outset, it felt less like two men meeting as equals and more like two worldviews colliding under unforgiving lights. Raskin arrived in Arizona expecting to do what he has done for years on cable news and in committee hearings, which is to frame arguments around norms, institutional guardrails, and the moral obligations of public office. His reputation as a constitutional law professor precedes him, and with it comes an assumption that reasoned explanation still holds persuasive power in a deeply fractured political environment. Trump, by contrast, entered the room convinced that explanation has become a liability, something his opponents hide behind when outcomes repeatedly fail to match promises. As an analyst, I see this as the central fault line in modern American politics, where one side believes the system can still be corrected through adherence to rules, while the other believes the rules themselves have become tools of selective enforcement. Neither assumption is entirely wrong, and that is precisely what makes confrontations like this so volatile. The moment Trump referenced evidence sitting beside him, he was not merely alluding to documents, but to a broader claim that institutions no longer tell the full story. By invoking tangible objects, folders, timelines, and records, he positioned himself as someone bypassing intermediaries and speaking directly to the public. Raskin, sensing the danger, attempted to reassert structure by appealing to moderation and ground rules, a move that would have seemed reasonable in almost any other era. The crowd's reaction made clear how much that era has changed, because calls for order were interpreted not as fairness, but as avoidance. When trust in referees erodes, the very act of citing rules can sound like an admission that the rules no longer convince anyone. From my professional perspective, this is where Trump's rhetorical strategy becomes most effective, because it exploits a widespread feeling that accountability is unevenly applied. He does not need to prove wrongdoing beyond doubt to succeed in this environment. He only needs to suggest that scrutiny flows in one direction. Raskin's challenge is structural rather than personal, because defending institutional integrity requires faith that many in the room have already lost. Every time Raskin attempted to contextualize or qualify, the audience interpreted caution as deflection, even if the explanation itself was coherent. This dynamic ensures that aggression reads as honesty, while restraint risks being read as guilt, regardless of the underlying facts. The applause and chants that rippled through the room were not spontaneous eruptions so much as confirmations of an emotional contract already in place. Trump understands that his supporters do not come to these events primarily to learn new information, but to see their suspicions articulated with confidence. Raskin, conversely, appeared to believe that careful distinction still matters, that separating allegation from proof remains essential to democratic health. Here lies the tragedy of the exchange, because both impulses serve a purpose, yet they are increasingly incompatible in live political theater. The audience, caught between these approaches, leaned instinctively toward the one that validated their frustration rather than challenged it. As someone who values constitutional governance, I find myself torn at this stage of the confrontation. On one hand, Trump's willingness to confront perceived hypocrisy resonates because it speaks to genuine grievances about unequal treatment and elite insulation. On the other hand, the ease with which insinuation replaces adjudication raises serious concerns about how truth is determined in a democracy already strained by misinformation. Raskin's insistence on process feels necessary, yet insufficient, when those processes have failed to produce outcomes that restore public confidence. This tension is not about personalities alone, but about the sustainability of the system they are both trying in radically different ways to influence. The humor that began to surface was not light-hearted, but edged with contempt, designed to diminish rather than amuse. Trump's jokes landed because they aligned with a narrative of exposure, framing expertise itself as something suspicious when outcomes disappoint. Raskin's attempts to respond with seriousness struggled to gain traction, because seriousness without perceived consequence often feels hollow to a skeptical audience. Laughter in such settings functions as a verdict, signaling not just agreement but dominance, and cameras amplify it mercilessly. Once laughter turns against you, every word becomes heavier, and every pause feels longer than it actually is. It is important to note that, at this stage, no definitive conclusions had been reached, nor could they be in a venue like this. What was being established instead was a hierarchy of credibility, determined less by evidence than by emotional alignment. Trump spoke as if he were voicing what others were afraid to say, a role that carries enormous persuasive weight regardless of factual complexity. Raskin spoke as if the audience still shared a baseline respect for institutional nuance, a premise that may no longer hold. This mismatch explains why debates increasingly resemble trials without judges, verdicts without deliberation, and accusations without resolution. From an analytical standpoint, the real power of this opening exchange lies in its ability to frame everything that follows. By defining the conflict as one between exposure and evasion, Trump set the terms on which he wanted to be judged. Raskin, by resisting that framing, risked appearing disconnected from the emotional reality of the room, even if his arguments were internally consistent. The crowd did not want a seminar on ethics law. It wanted reassurance that someone was finally pushing back against perceived impunity. That desire, whether justified or not, is the engine driving moments like this into viral territory. As the first phase of the confrontation unfolded, it became clear that persuasion was no longer the primary objective. The objective was affirmation, the public confirmation that one's worldview was not only valid, but dominant in the moment. Trump sought to affirm suspicion, while Raskin sought to affirm restraint, and only one of those impulses feeds off spectacle. This imbalance does not mean one side is correct and the other wrong, but it does explain why outcomes feel predetermined. In environments governed by attention rather than deliberation, the loudest certainty often eclipses the quietest truth. What unsettled me most, watching this unfold, was not the aggression itself, but how normalized it has become. A decade ago, such an exchange would have been considered extraordinary, yet now it feels almost expected. This normalization suggests a deeper transformation in how Americans engage with power, authority, and accountability. We are no longer arguing about policy details first, but about whether the institutions meant to resolve those details deserve trust at all. Until that question is addressed, confrontations like this will continue to escalate, feeding on doubt rather than resolving it. The stage is fully set, not for reconciliation or mutual understanding, but for escalation. Trump has claimed the role of accuser-in-chief, while Raskin stands as the defender of norms under siege. The audience has chosen its emotional alignment, even if it has not yet chosen its conclusions. What comes next will deepen these divisions, sharpen the rhetoric, and test whether explanation can survive in a space dominated by suspicion. And that unresolved tension, heavy and unsettling, carries us directly into the next phase of this political confrontation. As the exchange moved beyond its opening shock, the atmosphere shifted from anticipation to something more dangerous, a sense that persuasion had already failed and only domination remained. Trump recognized this shift immediately and adjusted his tone, not by becoming louder, but by becoming more deliberate, as if inviting the audience to lean forward rather than brace themselves. Raskin, meanwhile, seemed caught between two instincts that rarely coexist comfortably: the instinct to explain carefully and the instinct to push back forcefully. From my standpoint as an observer of American political communication, this is the precise moment where debates cease to be contests of ideas and instead become tests of psychological endurance. Whoever appears more composed under pressure, more confident amid chaos, begins to own the narrative regardless of the substance underneath. Trump's strategy in this phase relied heavily on repetition, because repetition creates rhythm, and rhythm creates authority in a crowded room. He returned again and again to the same phrases about timing, access, and benefit, not adding new details so much as reinforcing emotional associations. Each repetition served as a drumbeat, making it harder for listeners to separate suggestion from confirmation. Raskin attempted to disrupt this rhythm by introducing nuance, but nuance often sounds like interruption when an audience is already moving with the beat. The result was a growing asymmetry, where one side sounded increasingly certain and the other increasingly defensive, even if that perception was misleading. From a communications perspective, Trump was not arguing facts so much as framing suspicion as common sense. He spoke as if the conclusion were obvious, implying that only insiders would question what seemed self-evident to ordinary people. Raskin's responses, grounded in legal distinctions and procedural explanations, required patience from an audience that had already decided patience was a luxury it could no longer afford. This dynamic illustrates a broader shift in political culture, where certainty is rewarded and caution is penalized, regardless of which one is more justified. In such an environment, the person who hesitates appears weaker than the person who charges ahead, even when hesitation is intellectually honest. Humor became a central weapon during this stretch, not because it lightened the mood, but because it sharpened the imbalance of power. Trump's jokes carried an edge, designed to elicit laughter that doubled as social pressure, signaling who belonged and who did not. Raskin's occasional attempts at dry wit fell flat, not because they were poorly crafted, but because the room was no longer receptive. Laughter, once it tilts decisively in one direction, becomes almost impossible to reverse, functioning as a collective judgment rather than a response to a punchline. Cameras captured every laugh and every awkward pause, ensuring that these moments would outlive the event itself in clips and headlines. As I watched, it became clear that the audience was no longer listening for answers, but for validation. Trump validated frustration by naming it, amplifying it, and treating it as evidence of truth rather than something to be examined. Raskin challenged that instinct by urging restraint, implicitly asking people to trust systems that had repeatedly disappointed them. This request, however reasonable in theory, struggled in practice because trust cannot be commanded once it has eroded. In that sense, Raskin was arguing uphill against a cultural current far larger than either of the men on stage. There is a temptation to dismiss moments like this as mere spectacle, but that would underestimate their significance. Spectacle shapes perception, and perception shapes legitimacy, especially in a media ecosystem driven by attention rather than deliberation. Trump understands this intuitively, having spent decades in environments where perception often mattered more than formal outcomes. Raskin, shaped by academia and legislative procedure, approaches legitimacy as something earned through consistency and adherence to rules. These differing assumptions about how authority is built explain much of the friction between them. At this stage, the accusations themselves almost recede into the background, replaced by a more fundamental question about credibility. Who sounds like they are telling the truth as people experience it, not as it is defined in statutes or footnotes. Trump speaks in a register that mirrors everyday suspicion, using language that feels accessible even when it is imprecise. Raskin speaks in a register that mirrors institutional caution, using language that is precise but often feels distant. Neither register is inherently superior, but in a hostile crowd, accessibility almost always wins. My own analysis leads me to an uncomfortable conclusion about modern political debate. We have built a system where appearing strong is often mistaken for being correct, and where emotional resonance eclipses evidentiary rigor. Trump exploits this system effectively, while Raskin resists it in the name of principles that many believe have already been compromised. This resistance is admirable in theory, yet politically costly in practice, especially when audiences are primed for confrontation rather than reflection. The cost is measured not only in applause lost, but in credibility ceded to more aggressive voices. As the exchange wore on, Trump increasingly framed himself as a proxy for the audience's grievances. He spoke not just as an individual defending himself, but as someone channeling collective frustration toward a visible target. Raskin, by contrast, appeared isolated, defending abstract norms without the emotional reinforcement of a crowd eager to protect them. This imbalance made every rebuttal feel smaller than the accusation it attempted to answer. Once that perception takes hold, it becomes self-reinforcing, shaping how each subsequent moment is interpreted. Another subtle shift occurred in how time was used as a rhetorical device. Trump compressed timelines, suggesting immediacy and inevitability, while Raskin expanded them, emphasizing process and deliberation. In a culture conditioned by instant feedback and rapid judgment, compressed time feels more authentic than extended explanation. Raskin's insistence on careful sequencing may have been legally appropriate, but it clashed with the audience's emotional tempo. This clash highlights a growing gap between how institutions operate and how citizens experience political reality. From a broader analytical lens, this confrontation illustrates how suspicion has become a form of currency. Trump trades in suspicion freely, converting it into momentum and loyalty. Raskin tries to counter suspicion with trust, but trust cannot be manufactured on demand. It must be earned over time, and many in the room believed the time had already been squandered. Thus, suspicion flowed easily, while trust encountered resistance at every turn. There were moments when silence fell across the room, heavy and uneasy, revealing cracks beneath the bravado. Silence can signal discomfort, but it can also signal contemplation, and it was not always clear which was at play. Trump broke silence decisively, understanding that whoever fills the void first often defines its meaning. Raskin allowed silence to linger, perhaps hoping gravity would restore seriousness, but gravity rarely wins against adrenaline. The audience responded accordingly, gravitating toward the voice that refused to pause. The debate has fully transitioned from inquiry to performance. Facts still matter, but only insofar as they serve a narrative already embraced. Trump has successfully positioned himself as the embodiment of confrontation, daring anyone to challenge the assumptions he amplifies. Raskin has positioned himself as the embodiment of restraint, urging fidelity to principles that feel increasingly fragile. The stage is now set for deeper accusations, sharper contrasts, and an escalation that will test not just the two men involved, but the audience's relationship with truth itself. By the time the exchange entered its third phase, the argument had expanded far beyond the two men on stage and into a broader indictment of how power is perceived to operate in modern America. Trump no longer spoke as if he were merely responding to a challenge, but as if he were narrating a familiar story that many in the audience already believed they knew by heart. Raskin, meanwhile, found himself defending not just his own integrity, but the legitimacy of systems that increasingly struggle to command instinctive respect. From my perspective, this was the moment when the debate stopped being personal and became structural, exposing fractures that no single confrontation could realistically repair. What was unfolding was less an argument about ethics and more a referendum on whether Americans believe accountability still applies evenly across political classes. Trump leaned heavily into the concept of double standards, a phrase that resonates precisely because it does not require legal precision to feel true. He framed his remarks around the idea that certain people are scrutinized relentlessly, while others are protected by status, connections, or institutional complexity. This framing is powerful because it mirrors everyday experiences far outside politics, where people feel rules are enforced selectively depending on who you are. Raskin attempted to counter by emphasizing distinctions between perception and proof, but those distinctions rang hollow to listeners who believed outcomes mattered more than intentions. The crowd's reaction suggested that many had already concluded the system was uneven, regardless of how carefully it was defended. From an analytical standpoint, accusations of double standards are among the hardest to rebut because they rely on comparative intuition rather than isolated facts. Trump did not need to demonstrate a specific violation. He needed only to suggest a pattern that felt plausible given past disappointments. Raskin's replies, rooted in procedural explanations, struggled because procedures themselves were on trial in the minds of many watching. This created a rhetorical trap, where defending the system sounded like defending the very imbalance people resented. In such a context, even accurate explanations can feel like excuses rather than clarifications. The concept of accountability became the central battleground, not as a legal mechanism, but as a moral expectation. Trump spoke about accountability as something immediate and visible, something the public should be able to recognize without specialized knowledge. Raskin spoke about accountability as something structured and deliberate, unfolding through investigations, reviews, and institutional checks. These definitions are not mutually exclusive, yet they clash violently in live political theater. The audience was left to choose between accountability that feels satisfying and accountability that claims to be fair. It is here that media dynamics exert their most corrosive influence. Selective coverage, fragmented narratives, and partisan framing have conditioned audiences to assume bias before evidence. Trump leveraged this conditioning by implying that mainstream outlets protect certain figures while relentlessly pursuing others. Raskin countered by warning against cynicism, arguing that distrust itself can become a weapon that erodes democratic norms. Both claims carry weight, which is why the audience response remained intense but unresolved. As someone analyzed this moment, I find it impossible to ignore how deeply distrust now shapes political interpretation. Facts are no longer received neutrally, but filtered through expectations of manipulation. Trump's supporters interpret institutional defenses as confirmation of bias, while Raskin's supporters interpret Trump's accusations as reckless demagoguery. Each side sees the other not merely as mistaken, but as dangerous to the country's future. This mutual suspicion transforms debate into a zero-sum struggle rather than a search for shared understanding. Trump's rhetorical success in this phase rested on his ability to personalize abstract systems. He spoke about institutions as if they were conscious actors with motives capable of favoritism and concealment. This personalization makes complex processes emotionally legible, even if it oversimplifies reality. Raskin resisted this framing by emphasizing impersonal rules and constraints, insisting that systems do not think or scheme. Yet impersonal explanations rarely satisfy audiences looking for accountability that feels human and tangible. The crowd's reactions revealed how deeply the idea of selective outrage has taken root. People sense that some controversies dominate headlines while others disappear quietly, and they draw conclusions accordingly. Trump tapped into this sense by questioning why certain stories receive relentless attention while others are dismissed or contextualized away. Raskin argued that not all allegations are equal and that proportionality matters, but proportionality is a hard sell when trust is already compromised. The result was a widening gap between how elites evaluate controversy and how the public experiences it. In this phase, the humor largely vanished, replaced by a heavier, more confrontational tone. The jokes had done their work, softening resistance and establishing dominance, and now seriousness took over. Trump's voice carried the certainty of someone convinced that exposure itself is a moral act. Raskin's voice carried the urgency of someone warning that exposure without standards can destroy innocent reputations and institutions alike. The room absorbed both messages, yet gravitated toward the one that aligned with its pre-existing doubts. I find it telling that neither man focused extensively on policy outcomes during this stretch. Healthcare, education, and economic specifics faded into the background, eclipsed by arguments about legitimacy. This shift reflects a broader reality in American politics, where trust has become a prerequisite for policy discussion. Without trust, even well-designed proposals are viewed with suspicion. The debate thus mirrored a country stuck arguing about referees instead of plays. Trump's critics often accuse him of undermining democratic norms, and there is merit to that concern. Yet his appeal lies in the perception that those norms have already failed to protect ordinary citizens from unequal treatment. Raskin's defense of norms assumes they still function adequately, an assumption many in the audience no longer share. This disconnect explains why calls for institutional patience can sound dismissive rather than responsible. When faith in fairness collapses, urgency replaces restraint as the dominant political emotion. Another layer emerged around the idea of expertise itself. Raskin represents a tradition that values specialized knowledge as a safeguard against rash decisions. Trump challenges that tradition by framing expertise as insulation from accountability. Neither view is entirely wrong, but the tension between them is increasingly unresolved. In an age of information overload, expertise competes with intuition, and intuition often wins because it feels empowering. As this part of the confrontation unfolded, I was struck by how little space remained for genuine uncertainty. Admitting uncertainty is intellectually honest, but politically risky in a polarized environment. Trump rarely concedes doubt because certainty is central to his appeal. Raskin acknowledges complexity, but complexity can sound like hesitation to an audience craving decisiveness. This asymmetry rewards overconfidence and punishes caution, regardless of accuracy. The accusations of double standards also carried an implicit moral challenge. Trump asked indirectly why ordinary people face consequences swiftly, while elites navigate endless processes. Raskin replied indirectly that due process exists to protect everyone including the innocent. Both statements are true in isolation, yet clash when applied to a system perceived as unequal. The audience was left weighing fairness against speed, principle against satisfaction. From a systems perspective, this moment illustrates how legitimacy erodes incrementally rather than all at once. Each perceived inconsistency chips away at trust until explanations no longer persuade. Trump's rhetoric accelerates this erosion by naming it openly, while Raskin's rhetoric attempts to slow it by reaffirming standards. Neither approach alone can restore legitimacy once skepticism has hardened into belief. The confrontation thus becomes a symptom rather than a solution. As the debate approaches its conclusion, the stakes feel unmistakably higher. What began as a sharp exchange now resembles a broader cultural trial of institutions themselves. Trump stands as the voice of exposure, insisting that sunlight justifies discomfort. Raskin stands as the voice of caution, insisting that sunlight without structure can burn indiscriminately. The audience is left to decide which risk feels more tolerable in a nation struggling to reconcile fairness with faith. As the debate moved into its final stretch, the energy in the room shifted from confrontation toward something heavier and more reflective, as if both men sensed they were no longer arguing for the crowd in front of them alone, but for an audience far beyond the walls of the venue. Trump spoke with the confidence of someone who believes history will eventually vindicate his instincts, framing the confrontation as proof that the political class can only survive so long without being challenged directly. Raskin, by contrast, adopted a tone that suggested concern not merely about the accusations themselves, but about the precedent such confrontations might set for future political discourse. From my own perspective, this was the moment when the debate most clearly revealed the philosophical divide between populist confrontation and institutional preservation. The question was no longer who won the exchange, but what kind of political culture Americans are choosing to reward. Trump's closing arguments emphasized that disruption, even when uncomfortable, is sometimes necessary to expose stagnation and hypocrisy. He portrayed himself as a catalyst rather than a caretaker, someone willing to break norms precisely because those norms have shielded entrenched interests. This framing resonates with voters who feel alienated by procedural language and incremental reform. Raskin countered by arguing that disruption without guardrails risks empowering the loudest voices at the expense of fairness and truth. To him, norms are not obstacles, but safeguards designed to prevent power from being wielded recklessly. The tension between these positions reflects a deeper American anxiety about authority. Many citizens want strong action, but fear unchecked power. Trump embodies decisiveness and confrontation, qualities that appeal in times of frustration. Raskin embodies deliberation and restraint, qualities that appeal to those who fear instability more than stagnation. The debate forced viewers to confront which fear feels more urgent in the current moment. Humor briefly resurfaced as Trump mocked the predictability of political defenses, suggesting that every controversy now comes with a script of denial, deflection, and eventual normalization. The crowd laughed, not necessarily because the joke was clever, but because it felt familiar. Raskin responded with dry irony, pointing out that ridicule does not substitute for evidence. This exchange underscored how humor has become a weapon rather than a release in modern political debates. laughter now signals allegiance as much as amusement. From an analytical standpoint, Trump's strategy in the final phase was to collapse distinctions between legal innocence and moral responsibility. He implied that even if actions are technically permissible, they can still violate public trust. Raskin insisted that collapsing those distinctions invites chaos because it allows perception to replace proof. This disagreement goes to the heart of contemporary political conflict, where moral outrage often outruns legal process. The audience was left to decide whether trust should be restored by stricter enforcement or by broader transparency. Another theme that emerged was the idea of narrative dominance. Trump argued, implicitly, that whoever controls the story controls legitimacy. Raskin warned that storytelling without verification can turn politics into spectacle rather than governance. Both men understood that modern politics is inseparable from media dynamics, where emotion travels faster than nuance. Their disagreement was less about facts than about how facts should be presented and interpreted. As the debate wound down, Trump framed his campaign as a referendum on elite credibility. He suggested that repeated failures have forfeited the public's obligation to defer to institutional voices. Raskin argued that abandoning deference entirely risks replacing flawed institutions with personality-driven authority. This exchange highlighted a paradox at the center of American democracy. Distrust fuels reform, but excessive distrust can undermine the very mechanisms needed to implement it. The audience response suggested that many are willing to accept that risk if it promises accountability. I find it important to acknowledge that both positions contain valid concerns. Institutions can and do fail, sometimes spectacularly, and exposing those failures is essential. At the same time, institutions exist precisely because unrestrained power has historically led to abuse. The challenge lies in reforming systems without delegitimizing them entirely. This balance was never resolved in the debate, and perhaps cannot be resolved in a single exchange. Trump's final remarks leaned heavily on the idea that transparency itself is a democratic virtue. He argued that sunlight forces correction, even if it causes discomfort in the short term. Raskin responded by cautioning that constant exposure without context can erode trust faster than secrecy ever could. Both men appealed to democratic values, yet emphasized different aspects of them. This divergence illustrates how shared principles can lead to radically different conclusions. As the moderator attempted to close the event, it was clear that neither side had persuaded the other. Instead, each had reinforced the beliefs of those already inclined to agree. This outcome reflects a broader pattern in contemporary political discourse, where debates clarify divisions rather than bridge them. Yet clarity itself has value, even when consensus remains elusive. Understanding the depth of disagreement is a prerequisite for any meaningful resolution. In reflecting on this confrontation, I am struck by how it encapsulates the current American political moment. Trump represents a demand for immediate, visceral accountability that bypasses traditional filters. Raskin represents a defense of process, restraint, and institutional continuity. The clash between them is not merely personal, but emblematic of a nation debating how power should be challenged and constrained. Neither approach can succeed alone without producing unintended consequences. The audience left with more questions than answers, which may be the most honest outcome. Can transparency coexist with due process in an era of instant judgment? Can institutions regain trust without radical reform? Can disruption be harnessed constructively rather than destructively? These questions lingered long after the final words were spoken. Ultimately, the debate underscored that American politics is less about left versus right than about confidence versus caution. Trump channels a belief that confidence itself can correct imbalance. Raskin channels a belief that caution is necessary to prevent greater harm. The future will likely be shaped by how these impulses are reconciled rather than by the victory of one over the other. Until then, confrontations like this will continue to captivate audiences precisely because they reflect unresolved tensions within the country.